Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. welcomes Clint Schneckloth to the podcast. Clint is pastor of Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Fayetteville, Arkansas, a progressive church in the South. He is the founder of Canopy NWA, a refugee resettlement agency, and Queer Camp, and is the author of A Guidebook to Progressive Church. He blogs as Lutheran Confessions on Substack. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr., and I am pleased to be joined today by Clint Schneckloth. Did I get that right?
You got that right.
All
Nice
right.
job.
Thank you. Welcome to the show. Is there anything else you'd like
Yeah.
our listeners to know about you?
Well, apparently we're both calling in from cold locations this morning.
Yeah.
Colorado and Arkansas. It's kind of rough out there.
Well, beyond the weather, why don't you share just kind of about your faith background, what that looked like in the past and what that looks like today?
Oh, sure. Well, I was born and raised and still am in the Lutheran tradition. ELCA is the denomination.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew up as a kind of a Midwestern mainline kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
That's got a whole kind of shape around it, I would say, liturgical, but also informal and campy. And I've been thinking a lot about this lately too, just because when I was growing up, I remember there being a pretty broad spectrum of politics and kind of perspectives within the one denomination. There was always the joke that they told, that why are there altar rails in Episcopal and Lutheran churches? It's to divide the Democrats from the Republicans. But it was like a 60-40 split. It'd be like 60% of the clergy were Democrat and 40% of the parish. And so I grew up in a large church in Iowa, St. Paul Lutheran. It was one of those that was kind of like a big church before the mega churches. And my grandpa was a state representative, Republican, in the state of Iowa. And so I had a lot of exposure to some of that kind of stuff, kind of the connection between care and community and political decision making at the state level. And then I went to Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. This is where I kind of had a big transformative moment, had a lot of friends and colleagues who were queer. And I made a shift. I started out college being literally anti-LGBTQ, and even participated in campaigns of various sorts against more full inclusion. And I ended my college career as the congregation president, bringing Luther College in as a Reconciling in Christ congregation,
Wow.
which is like the movement for full inclusion in the denomination at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to Luther Seminary. That's up in the Twin Cities, and did my seminary. And along the way, I've just always done church stuff. So I'm just a church guy in a pretty significant way. I worked and then was a camp director at a Lutheran Bible camp in Iowa. My wife and I served as missionaries in Slovakia with our denomination for about 3 years. Did some youth director gigs and stuff like that. And then I served some rural parishes up in Minnesota and Iowa, or excuse me, Minnesota and Wisconsin before I came down to Arkansas.
Yeah, cool. I can already hear, like, in your background, perhaps, hopefully I'm not making assumptions, but it feels like I can hear how your experience has really shaped the book we're going to talk about here. Share, if you can, just about some spiritual practices that are meaningful for you.
I don't know if I'm very good at them, to be honest. uh, or I would say that the way that I think about spiritual practices maybe is a little bit different than than normal.
Sure.
Like I am not the get up in the morning and journal
Mm-hmm.
kind of guy, and I'm not very good at meditation. Although when I do meditate or do those kinds of things, I appreciate doing it. My spiritual practices are more along the lines of how can I pay attention to the world and then be annoying in gospel-centric ways. So a lot of my spiritual practices are around drawing attention to injustice, using platforms and communication methods to draw discourses in particular directions. And a lot of my spiritual practice is really trying to be embedded with and know the communities that I especially advocate for, in particular if I'm not part of that community. So like, we have residents who live at our church. We've started taking in more and more unsheltered people just into the church building. So some of my spiritual practices are like, how do you build reciprocity between providing shelter for people and also having them really think of themselves as also contributing something to you. One of our residents the other day had gone and put a frozen pizza in the oven, and then she was walking by my office while I was working, and she's like, brought me a slice of pizza, and so how do I kind of, keep in mind that I'm hungry too, and that we're kind of all in this together. That's a big part of my spirituality, I would say.
Yeah, the awareness, if I'm hearing you right, the awareness of recognizing and receiving the gifts folks are trying to make.
Yeah, or even not just gifts, but like that we literally just are in community together, and so you just share stuff.
Yeah. Well, cool. Thanks for sharing that. So, I'm looking forward to having this conversation, Clint. We're going to talk about Clint's book, A Guidebook to Progressive Church. Is there a subtitle? I'm not seeing a subtitle.
There's not.
I guess no subtitle. Okay, A Guidebook to Progressive Church. It's out. It's available for folks. So I want to start, because I think this is the most interesting. When I first talked to you, when I was first introduced to the book, I want to start by why you chose to write about progressive church rather than progressive Christianity.
Yeah. Because I'm committed my whole life to church community, in spite of the way in which a lot of the people around me in their spiritual lives struggle with, or maybe have even been harmed by, prior Christian communities. There's a really, there's a good reason why many people have left church and are never planning to come back. And I totally identify with that and can see why some people would make the decision that for their own like spiritual well-being, personal well-being, that they just can't cross the threshold of a church. But I've also seen repeatedly how for many people, it's coming back into church community that's been the way that they heal.
Mm-hmm.
I write about this in the book, in some of the content around religious trauma and church. There's some really good studies now coming out that show how getting re-engaged in ways that are affirming of yourself can be incredibly spiritual healing for people. But I'm also committed to the church because I'm simply not willing to let the abuse of something disallow its proper use.
Right.
Which that's something I say often in the book. Just because, the analogy would be like, so just because you don't like McDonald's, therefore you're not going to eat burgers. If somebody can make a really good burger, why are you going to reject all the good burgers because McDonald's makes fake burgers, And the same goes for like church community. Just because some people really abuse it or use it for the wrong reasons doesn't mean that church rightly organized
Mm-hmm.
and practiced isn't one of the most incredibly impactful and powerful things in the world. So that's why I wrote about progressive church. There's also a thing in publishing. There are more books on progressive values,
Right.
or an understanding of progressive Christianity, but there's a lot less out there just about progressive church practiced as community.
So I think this kind of leads into, again, I don't want to get too deep into this because I do want to talk about the book, but I really feel like this is a philosophical point, if even that's the right word, that really kind of undergirds the overarching theme or philosophy of your book.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of willingness to accept or work within church and Christianity and not kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use another phrase. And I feel like I'm kind of already getting off topic here in some ways, but I feel like this is a trend that I'm seeing, at least, again and again and again in so-called progressive Christian circles. And that it's almost like folks see, I'm literally like working on a Substack on this. So that's why I really appreciate your book. That it's like, again, it's kind of this throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like it's all too corrupt. And I think you have a quote to that. But yeah, what comes to mind for you there?
I've got this neighbor who recently went to Yale Divinity School. She lived here in the Northwest Arkansas, and she just recently moved to Yale.
Mm-hmm.
And we were in a running club together. That's how I met her. And she has never really gone to church,
Mm-hmm.
but she's going to divinity school.
Yeah.
And we were talking about, she was asking me for like a guidance or advice on, like, what should I do when I'm going to divinity school? What are your insights? Because she was asking me this because of how I practice Christianity in our church, even though she doesn't go to our church.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, when you get to Yale, you should find a church.
Yeah.
And you should connect to a church, because that's going to be your incubator for testing out whatever it is you're thinking about or coming up with in seminary. And her response was, well, is it okay if I just think of my garden as my church? And I'm not at all dismissive of that. I think that there are probably very spiritual people for whom gardening is the incubator for their spirituality, and that's fine. It's like, I'm pretty respectful of lots of different religious traditions. But if I would argue that if you want to work for justice and progressive values in the world in the way that I do it,
yeah,
you have to do it in a community. And it might be that community has very loose, porous boundaries with other kinds of organizations, but to ground it in the gospel of Jesus Christ and to influence the world in the ways that I think church uniquely does, you're going to want to commit to a local church. That's kind of a deep, uh, and that comes out of my lived experience,
Right.
like of how I've seen, and there's so many just practical examples. Like one practical example would be churches are third spaces.
Mm-hmm.
They're not a business and they're not the
Right.
government. And so they are able to provide this kind of space and intersection that other organizations can't do because like a business is trying to make money. So you can't look political because, that's politics is bad for business. They always
Mm-hmm.
say, right?
Right.
So businesses are always going to test the winds and see what's going to be most marketable. Same with politics. Politicians have to get elected. It's only the church. And you saw this illustrated super well last week with this Bishop Booty. I don't
Right.
know how to
Right.
say her last name in DC. It's only the church that can kind of whimsically step out and do that she did with all the attendant risks, I think.
Yeah.
Or that's part of what I really deeply believe.
Yeah. 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 I'm reminded of this quote, and I'll read it here. You write this in the context of the importance of worship, which again, I think is interesting. And I want to talk more about this, why worship matters, because I think this is a key aspect of church in this kind of progressive sphere that seems to get diluted as either unimportant or less important than the so-called work, justice, being on the streets, whatever. So you're right, progressive Christianity is much more this worldly than other forms of Christianity focused on the imminent frame and action in the world. Worship, which is assumed to be primarily about the transcendent frame and otherworldly focused, is to those of this perspective simply perceived as at best a waste of time and at worst a distraction from the weightier matters of social justice and love love of neighbor. So I want to stay on this point because this is something I feel strongly about, and this is one of the reasons I really resonated with the book. That I think that we are seeing this trend where, again, as you say, worship, this kind of gathered community to worship God, is seen as at best a waste of time or at worst a distraction. So you argue really in these pages, from what I read, from what I understood, really as grounding, as the importance of grounding oneself in these Christian and spiritual practices as a way to then go forth and do justice. So talk more about why this worship and such really matters.
Well, one thing I try to say to progressives who aren't sure that they want to go to church every week, because this is a huge dynamic. I think this is a huge split on the conservative liberal Christian side. Conservatives are all in on weekly worship. Sometimes it's because of demand, like it's an actual Roman Catholic law, right, within canon law that you're supposed to worship weekly and go to the Eucharist. And I think a lot of fundamentalists and conservatives on the Protestant side probably just have an internal legalism around that that's similar.
Yes. Right. Sometimes it's explicit legalism of you better show up to church.
Yeah. But on the more positive side, it also, a lot of conservative Christianity, it takes place in rural areas where people don't have a lot of other community.
Right.
And so people are like, this is where they get it. Progressive liberal church tends to be a little bit more on the urban diploma busy side of the equation, where they've got a lot of other social connection, and so they're uncertain whether church is even necessary for their total social life. And then does it have any value when so much of progressive Christianity is focused on love of neighbor? So my first point to progressives is you should show up to church for other people. If you really think that progressive Christianity is primarily about love of neighbor, what better way to love your neighbor than to show up every week with other people and check in with your fellow community members? That might mean that we need to redesign worship
Sure.
so that there's more capacity to do that, because so much of worship in our traditions is very passive.
Right.
You can sneak, mega church, you can like sneak in and sneak out and not talk to anybody, you know? So maybe that needs some reshaping, but the point is still valid. And when I raise that with people, they're frequently surprised, because I think the majority of people that think that worship is for you and your spirituality, I go to get fed, is like the most common thing that people say. And I kind of want to be like, don't go to get fed, like go to like take care of somebody else. If somebody has gone to church who's alone, who's recently divorced, who's traumatized by the inauguration in this new regime, whatever, go to church and care for somebody, and you do it weekly, because that's about the rate that a lot of communities care for each other. The German Stammtisch, or the, you know, whatever the thing is that you do, that's about the pace you need to keep up. But man, that is a hard sell for a progressive Christian. On average.
Yeah, it is. I want to move on here to kind of stay on this theme. You write about why a strong Christology and theology really matters. And I guess this really kind of ties into something else you wrote about the problem of Christian progressives abandoning faith commitments. And I think this broader trend, at least as I understand it, of like, we want to be as inclusive as possible, and being inclusive kind of in that translation means like, let's just remove all barriers and any kind of, I don't want to say boundaries, but also kind of like markers of who we are and what we're about. Does that make sense? And in the book, you really, as I understand it, you really argue for, I wouldn't say like firm or rigid, but also pretty solid theological foundations and groundings. Is that fair? Am I understanding you correct?
Yeah. I like to joke that we're where people come sometimes when they've been going to the Unitarian Church and they need more Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, our social perspective, our values or whatever is very aligned with the Unitarians. So I'm often showing up in spaces where there's like Unitarian leaders and we do similar things. But Unitarians are literally, you get to pick. And yeah, progressive Christianity, from my perspective, is still grounded in the theological tradition that comes out of Scripture and is grounded and centered in Christ. And I do think that I try to flip that around and say, like, our openness comes out of our groundedness. Because I feel secure in Christ, in the sense of who Christ is for me, it allows me to be open in my stance toward a lot of other things. And also, a lot of the things I'm opposed to and that Christ kind of teaches me to be opposed to, it's not like tarot card reading or my Muslim neighbor. It's more things like the divide between the rich and the poor, and how many billionaires we have, and how we treat immigrant neighbors, and, you know, all those kinds of things. That's where I get rigid, is around those things.
Yeah. So I think again, what I'm just going to keep mentioning these kind of random things, but because I think, again, this is what so stood out to me from your book, because of how like anti-cliche it was for like a book that's written as from a progressive lens. You write about the importance of leadership. And again, I don't want to like broad brush here, but I feel like in progressive circles, leadership is seen as this like, oh man, we can't have any leaders. We can't have anybody like, you know, an authority. There's just this anathema toward leadership or authority. And it becomes, I think, like you said about that UU church, where just like, rather than you can pick whatever, just everybody's just doing whatever, because there's no one like offering any kind of vision or leadership. Talk more about that.
Well, I think that my perspective on this is shaped by my commitment to phenomenological realism. it just is the case that leaders matter. You don't see major movements for change in the world that gather significant energy behind them
Mm-hmm.
that don't have a face of a person at
Yeah.
the front of it. Or it's very, very rare.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, you'll get something like Black Lives Matter, which was
Mm-hmm.
more like a team.
Right.
But most of the time, it's a person. Martin Luther King Jr. for civil rights,
Mm-hmm.
Donald
Gandhi.
Trump for
Yeah.
MAGA. Who's everybody like me looking back to and thinking, oh man, we wish this would have happened 8 years ago? Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
Who's our last remaining light right now? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You know, it's
Yeah.
like, I mean, it's
Yeah.
a person. It really is a person. And in my church, I would say that if you talk to people, they would be like, everybody feels super empowered. They think it's very lay level. And if you really press them on it, they would be like, the church is like this because of the way Clint has led it over 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
And for better or worse. And
Right.
what I mean by the phenomenological realism is it just functions that way. And so you can either try to deny it, or you can say leadership really has a kind of charism to it and try to handle that in as ethical a way as possible,
Mm-hmm.
which is what I would encourage.
Yeah. So talk more about what does that leadership look like for you, like in that context? Like, what are some kind of best practices? What are some ethics you try to stand by? What are some ways you try to empower others in leadership? What does that look like, practically speaking?
I can tell you what a couple of my parishioners have commented on about me to me that I think are hallmarks.
Okay.
One of my council members recently said that I'm the most available lead pastor they've ever encountered.
Mm-hmm.
I don't separate myself off from the congregation. I'm in the mix. And another new member said that one of the things that had her coming back was simply the fact that I'm not avoidant of helping with whatever needs done.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're as likely to find me in the kitchen doing the dishes as
Right.
preaching. And, so I think that part of this spiritual practice that's different for me as a leader, maybe, has to do with functioning in a lot of those grassroots roles,
Mm-hmm.
while also serving as the lead on things. You know, like Queer Camp, I'm both responsible for having started it, and I also entirely step back and am behind the scenes just doing grunt work the week of, because I'm a straight white guy and it's not really ideal for me to be the main face
Mm-hmm.
of the camp. So I'm more likely to be like running security or volunteering to lead a D&D session, or, you know, some other thing. And then there's other people who are actually the face of the camp.
I feel like it goes back to what you said earlier about the abuse of something does not disallow its proper use. Because we could say the same thing about leadership, right? Like the abuse of leadership does not disallow its proper use. Is that, again, kind of your argument here?
Yeah, I think that's yes. And I think there are some communities that kind of pull this off in a different way. Probably the most famous would be like the Quakers.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think there are some emerging ways or some ways we could explore that might be leaderless movement organizing. So I don't want to completely
Right.
undermine like those as an alternative. I just don't see normal communities most of the time sorting out how to do that. And I see, you know, I just see over and over again how like a school that has a good principal runs better.
Mm-hmm.
The police department's better if the police chief is a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
or gal. Like that just is a real frequent thing. I don't know how to get around that.
Country that has a good president.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
I don't want to take this off the rails here. I think one thing I really liked here is you talked about place sharing as a model for mission and evangelism. So talk more about that, because again, I feel like we're in this context where like anything E-word evangelism is obviously very seen as problematic, and sometimes for good reason in progressive circles, but so much so that again, it kind of like it they want to throw it all out. So I really was intrigued by your idea here of place sharing. So talk more about that.
Well, like a good example of this that's been emerging at Good Shepherd over the last number of years is we are now the location where Food Not Bombs cooks meals.
Hmm.
Food Not Bombs is an organization that it's a mutual aid organization. It's a group of people who oftentimes they do food recovery, and sometimes they buy the food, and then they prep big meals and they go down to like Walker Park, which is where a lot of our unsheltered people hang out when the weather is okay. And they go to where people are and take meals. And they cook on Sunday mornings. So our church smells like the meals they're preparing while we're getting ready for church, and they're around while I'm doing other stuff and getting ready for worship. And so I've got to know them. And now they've started having like their organizing meetings there. And when the cold weather shelter opened this winter, there was a shortage of groups that were going to serve breakfast. And I was talking with the executive director of the shelter org, and they had a couple of breakfasts that they needed served. And so I messaged the leader of Food Not Bombs and I was like, hey, we'll take a day. Do you guys want to take a day? And so then we started coordinating together. And I would say in some levels, they've started thinking of themselves as a member org of Good Shepherd, even though none of the people that are in that Food Not Bombs go to church at Good Shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
But when I serve the breakfast with people from my church, half the people that help volunteer for the breakfast are also people who don't go to worship on Sunday morning, even though they're connected to the church. And I kind of ask myself, like, well, who's being more religious here? The people who show up for worship on Sunday morning, or the people who make the biscuits and gravy on Monday morning for the cold weather shelter, But the better way to describe it is there's all these kind of like network effects.
Mm-hmm.
People are using their time in the way that they believe has value. And we're building community together in these kind of loosely affiliated ways that I think preach, and I think can have really good long-term impact in terms of if you want to talk about evangelism. Like, I think that's shaped the perception that group of people who are largely irreligious, their perception of what church can be.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like that's far more likely to have an impact than folks working alongside you, for example, rubbing shoulder to shoulder, seeing how you live out your faith is going to be far more appealing than, again, imagine walking up to like someone in Walker Park and being like, hey, accept Jesus and come to church. Like, that's going to be a hard sell.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, not to mention the fact that really most of the time when I go serve meals anywhere like that, they are more religious than I am.
Right.
And much better at preaching the gospel to me than I am ever preaching it to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I served a meal the other day and one guy came up and I was like, how are you? And he says, well, the world isn't fair, but God is good. And all the progressives would have just stopped with, the world isn't fair.
Right.
So yeah.
So let me ask this question then. And I think it's kind of like, I'm kind of repeating the same question, so forgive me if I'm beating the same horse. But again, I feel like we're in this context, broadly speaking, in progressive Christian circles where it's just like, we want to like kind of push out any kind of religiosity and worship and kind of turn. I mean, I literally saw this the other day of like a church wants to be a food pantry that worships rather than a church, which feels like a whole other conversation. But why again, repeat this, if anything, for me, why should progressive leaning Christians and faith groups like retain, I'm not sure what the word is, ground themselves still in as a church, as a worshiping community?
Yeah, I think I have a complex and evolving understanding of this that's developed over time. I have one parishioner who we were working on a grant, and the way she phrased it in the grant was that we are a community center that has a chapel.
Mm-hmm.
Describing Good Shepherd.
Right.
Because we do radically do way more community center type stuff than a lot of churches.
Mm-hmm.
And because people are used to church being almost exclusively church,
right,
even doing some of that seems really large to them. And then the amount that we do it is like next level. And so you could see where people would come to that perspective. But the base of people who still support our church, like that make it happen with their donations and that kind of thing, is still the group that worships there, And I think that the part that you're asking about that I haven't really talked much about is the way in which having a posture toward God
mm-hmm.
is related to the posture that we have toward our fellow humans in creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that if we're fully materialist in our perspective as a church, that the one problem there is, one problem is I don't think that the world is fully materialist.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that you just kind of hint at your book, which I, again, was really intrigued by, but go on.
Even though that's my main posture, like I've
Right.
been calling the church back to prioritizing neighbor love and neighbor care, I do think that there's much more than is dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio. That's really true just on a scientific level. But from a Christian perspective, Jesus's freedom towards his neighbors in love was grounded in the freedom that he felt and experienced in relationship to his Father.
Mm-hmm.
Those are related. At one point, he even says they're the same thing. What's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the two are essentially the same commandment, So I think that when we let go of the worship side, sometimes that can be a problem too, because it makes the neighbor without remainder and never puts you in this posture of the bigger. It can result in a number of things that are probably problematic, maybe not the least of which is perhaps a good focus on God can remind us that neighbor is not just the human, but all of creation.
Mm-hmm.
That somehow that the ground of being posture shapes how big our perspective is in terms of our values.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. I really want to recommend the book. There's a lot more in it that we haven't really touched on, I think. So again, the book is a guidebook to progressive church. I think, Clint, I said this on social media. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the book was just like, it was simple, but not in a simplistic way. I found it quite brilliant, but in a very digestible, readable way. So I really encourage folks to go check it out. Let's take a break. We'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Clint Schneckloth. Thank you so much for your conversation. Really appreciate your insights and points here. So, closing questions. We always tell folks you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. So, first question: if you're Pope for a day, what does that day look like for you? What do you want to do?
Pope for a day. Does this take place in the Vatican?
I mean, I leave it open. We leave it purposely ambiguous.
Okay. Huh. I guess that I all I can think of is that I love Rome enough that I kind of just want to go have coffee and some pastries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think I might get distracted by being in Rome or the Vatican and forget to actually do anything serious or helpful.
That's fair. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life.
Oh, wow. Well, I probably have to say Alan Eccleston because I've been doing a lot of work around him here the last couple of years. I went to England last November and visited with some of his family. Alan was a Church of England clergy person who was also a lifelong member of the Communist Party in England and understood those two to be directly related to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And just had a very unique way of leading parish life in Sheffield, England, where he served. And I came as close as I could actually by going there to, meeting him in person because I got to spend time with his son and his wife. They're now in their 80s. And then I went back to London and spent a few days walking around London with his granddaughter.
Wow. All right, another ambiguous question. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Wow. That we allowed the oligarchs to win.
I mean, I hope they have not won, but it does appear they are winning for sure. Present tense.
Yeah. Well, and we seem to, at least so far, one of the most prescient novels I've ever read around this whole thing is The Circle.
Okay.
By Dave Eggers.
Okay, I'm going to check that out.
Basically the premise is that Facebook buys Google and they become The Circle. That's the company.
Oh, because they did a TV show on this, didn't they?
Maybe. I don't know.
I feel like or there's a movie I feel like I saw something.
Could be, but there's the main character. She infiltrates the company and she keeps introducing really bad ideas because she thinks that'll finally tear it down. And every single one of them, instead, they take it and they run with it and everybody loves it. And I think this is this is the big problem of neoliberalism is it can take all of its opposition and subsume it into itself like the Borg and just make it part of itself. And that's what we're seeing over and over again.
Yeah. Oh man, that's kind of what's the word of dystopian? That's kind of dystopian. How about something positive?
Oh yeah.
What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
Well, what do I hope for the future of Christianity? I think that we are seeing right now, on some level, some increased interest in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my hope this week is that the counterbalance we saw that was so shared so widely from that sermon of the bishop in DC
Yeah. Yeah.
will be understood to have arisen out of the grassroots life of the church in progressive communities. That wasn't just some vague idealistic thing that a woman in DC said, but arises out of the culture and the community that has
lived out,
practiced that enough that she was free enough to say that there.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen some of that in the media that's been following up where they point out like, you know, this is not just a one-off. This is also the woman that brought
Matthew
Shepard's remains to the National Cathedral. This is, you know, she's been in this.
Yeah, this is not just hot takes by her.
Right.
She's been practicing mercy her entire career.
Right. There's still an issue. I think there's still an issue that came from the most elite of the mainline denominations. There's a lot of other like poorer, less prominent. You know, the Episcopal Church is a little bit the state church kind of thing.
Right.
But so there's that issue to deal with. I think we're gonna have to figure out how to translate this into ways that make sense to people who are poor and country in ways that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah.
So I guess those are aspirational hopes of mine too.
Let me stay on this, even though we're supposed to be wrapping up here. Let me just ask you, because I feel like this is a huge disconnect. We're seeing it from data like Ryan Burge and others about this huge class disconnect where folks who are more wealthy and educated are more likely to go to church. Folks who are less educated, less wealthy are increasingly less likely to go to church, less likely to be involved in community organizations, church, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe closing question this, like, how do we make this progressive Christianity, especially as I love the way you wrote about it throughout the book, accessible in a way that really resonates, communicates, impacts folks who are low income, working class, you know, struggling to pay their bills, less educated, etc.
Well, that's interesting. I just thought of something. I would have to process whether I'm going to agree later with what I'm going to say right now.
Sure.
But a lot of times liberal elites are asking me, what can we do to overcome this divide?
Mm-hmm.
So is it really dumb of me to say, go to church? I mean, if you want to like identify with the rural poor.
Yeah.
Or people on the other side of the aisle, you could do a lot worse to move toward them than to be as religious as them in practice, so that the way you live appears like the way that they live in ways that they can kind of understand and could cause some certain level of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
I'm only suspicious of saying that because it's maybe self-serving, because I'm always wanting to grow the progressive church.
Right.
It is an impulse I have.
I suppose it wouldn't be growing your church, though. It'd be growing, you know, Southern Baptist, Independent Baptist type, these very conservative churches. And I think that cognitive dissonance is, if I can soapbox from it, like that's essential. Like, we're going to have to see each other not as these evil caricatures, but as human beings who have many of the same wants and needs and desires and cares as one another. And I'm also, again, to bring it back to your book and what you said earlier, I'm reminded of your point about place sharing. Like, what's more literal about place sharing in evangelism than going to meet your neighbors? I mean, it's kind of like you said about going to Walker Park, right? You're going to a place to share in life with them.
Yeah. Although I think I wouldn't go that far. I don't think I would tell people to go to Southern Baptist churches, because I generally am not going to encourage people to go to bigoted churches that don't allow women in leadership or queer people to be married. So I was being selfish in the sense of you should go to progressive churches. There's a meme right now of like, if you're, hey guys, just so you know, there's a church with a woke lady pastor within walking distance of your house.
Yes.
And if you're under 50, they're going to be super excited and they're going to give you free donuts. You know, like
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the meme I have in the back of my mind, but I really identify with that. But so what I mean is it does make it harder I think for both either side to entirely dismiss each other if a lot of their practices and communal practices are the same. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not inconsequential that the
Right.
place where Donald Trump heard that challenge, have mercy, was in a
Hmm.
liberal church.
Yeah.
Like I think that's huge. He had to go there. It was part of
Yeah.
the whole inauguration thing. And so like,
Well, and this gets me on my other soapbox, which we don't have time for, but which is the essentialness of these institutions, these liberal churches continuing to exist so that people can go to them and hear these have mercy messages. But we don't have time for that, perhaps.
that's why I'm a progressive pastor in Arkansas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's hard to convince my colleagues to come here. It took 4 years for the church to get a pastor.
Wow.
All my liberal colleagues like to stay where there's more Lutherans, so
Yeah.
Minnesota, Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of reasons for that, family and jobs and whatever, but it's really crucial to be a witness in some of these places.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me do one last, I think this is kind of a Lutheran thing too, right? Leave you with a word of peace. You all do that, right? Speaking of a shared practice, well, let me leave you with a word of peace. May God's peace be with you.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.